The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Captain Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands, usually steady as granite, trembled slightly from exhaustion, and something else he refused to acknowledge: doubt. Behind him, his 8-man SEAL team crouched in defensive positions among the rocky outcrop, their ammunition running dangerously low after 18 hours of continuous combat. Rodriguez had led countless missions in his 12-year career with SEAL Team 6, but nothing had prepared him for this nightmare. What was supposed to be a routine extraction of a high-value intelligence asset had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse with an entire Taliban regiment. The intel had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Instead of finding their target in a small village compound, they had walked straight into a carefully orchestrated trap. The mission had started 3 days earlier at Bagram Air Base. Rodriguez remembered the briefing room, filled with the usual mixture of confidence and controlled tension that preceded every operation. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer, had spread aerial photographs across the metal table, pointing to a cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in a valley 30 miles southwest of Kabul. "Gentlemen, meet Khalil Ahmad," she had said, sliding a photograph of a bearded man in traditional Afghan clothing across the table. "Former Taliban commander turned CIA asset. He's been feeding us information about insurgent activities for the past 8 months. 3 days ago, he sent an emergency signal. Says he has intelligence about a major attack planned against coalition forces." Rodriguez had studied the photograph carefully. Ahmad's eyes held the haunted look of a man living on borrowed time. Betraying the Taliban was a death sentence, and everyone in the room knew it. The captain had seen that same look in the eyes of other assets who had eventually been discovered and executed. "What's the extraction plan?" Rodriguez had asked, already mentally preparing his team for the complexities of the mission. "Simple in and out," Colonel Mitchell had replied. "You'll be inserted by helicopter 2 clicks north of the village at 0200 hours. Ahmad will be waiting at the designated safe house. Grab him and get out before sunrise. Intel suggests minimal Taliban presence in the area." But as Rodriguez now watched enemy muzzle flashes light up the mountainside below their position, he realized just how wrong that intelligence had been. The Taliban hadn't just discovered Ahmad's betrayal. They had used him as bait to draw out American special forces. The old commander had either been turned back to their side or was already dead. The helicopter insertion had gone smoothly enough. Rodriguez's team, comprised of some of the most elite warriors in the American military, had rappelled into the darkness without incident. Sergeant Mike Thompson, the team's demolitions expert, had taken point as they moved through the rocky terrain toward the village. Behind him, Petty Officer Jake Sullivan handled communications while Corpsman Danny Martinez carried the medical supplies that might be needed for their wounded asset. They had approached the safe house with textbook precision, using night vision goggles to navigate the narrow alleyways between the ancient buildings. The village seemed eerily quiet, with no signs of the normal nighttime activity they had observed in other Afghan settlements. Even the dogs that usually barked at the slightest disturbance remained silent. Rodriguez should have recognized the warning signs, but the pressure to complete the mission had clouded his judgment. Washington was demanding results, and Ahmad's intelligence had already proven valuable in preventing 2 suicide bombings in Kabul. The captain had convinced himself that the Taliban simply hadn't discovered their asset's location. Yet, the safe house sat at the edge of the village, a 2-story structure with thick walls and a flat roof that provided good defensive positions. Rodriguez had positioned his snipers, Petty Officers Alex Chen and David Wilson, on the neighboring rooftop while the rest of the team approached the building's entrance. Everything had seemed normal until Thompson pushed open the wooden door and stepped inside. The explosion that followed had been deafening, throwing the sergeant backward into the street and alerting every Taliban fighter within 5 miles to their presence. It wasn't just an improvised explosive device. The entire building had been rigged to explode. As Thompson lay bleeding in the dust, Rodriguez had made the split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of immediately calling for extraction, he had ordered his team to secure the area and search for Ahmad. Pride and determination had overridden tactical sense, and now they were paying the price. The Taliban attack had come in waves, each one more coordinated than the last. Rodriguez quickly realized they were facing experienced fighters, not the usual collection of poorly trained insurgents his team typically encountered. These men moved with military precision, using covering fire and flanking maneuvers that suggested formal training. Within hours, the SEALs found themselves trapped in their current position on the mountainside, having been forced to retreat from the village under heavy fire. Thompson's injuries had slowed their movement, and Martinez was working frantically to keep the demolitions expert alive, while bullets whistled overhead. The radio crackled with static as Sullivan attempted to contact their extraction helicopter. "Razor 1, this is Ghost Team, over," he called repeatedly, but received only silence in response. Either the Taliban were jamming their communications, or something had happened to their air support. Rodriguez watched the sun climb higher into the cloudless sky. Knowing that daylight would make their position even more vulnerable, the Taliban fighters below were regrouping, preparing for what would likely be their final assault. His team had fought bravely, but they were outnumbered at least 20-1, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. The captain closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about his wife Maria and their 2 young children back in Virginia Beach. He had promised them he would come home from this deployment, just as he had promised after every previous mission. But as he opened his eyes and saw the determination in his team's faces, Rodriguez realized that some promises might be impossible to keep. The sound of approaching footsteps on the rocks below snapped him back to the present. The Taliban's final assault was beginning, and Captain Marcus Rodriguez knew that the next few minutes would determine whether any of his team would see home again. The first Taliban fighter appeared around the boulder to Rodriguez's left, his AK-47 already raised and firing. Petty Officer Chen's sniper rifle cracked once, and the insurgent crumpled to the ground, but 3 more immediately took his place. The final battle for the rocky outcrop had begun. Rodriguez squeezed his trigger in controlled bursts, each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos erupting around him. 12 years of training and combat experience guided his movements as he shifted from target to target, but deep down, he knew they were fighting a losing battle. His team was down to their last few magazines, and the Taliban seemed to have an endless supply of fighters willing to die for their cause. "Captain, we've got movement on the right flank," shouted Petty Officer Wilson from his position behind a cluster of rocks 30 yards away. Rodriguez swiveled his rifle in that direction and saw at least a dozen Taliban fighters scaling the steep mountainside. Using the natural terrain to shield their approach, the SEAL team's position, which had seemed defensible in the darkness, was rapidly becoming a death trap in broad daylight. The rocky outcrop that had provided cover during their retreat now felt like a prison, with enemy fighters able to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Sergeant Thompson, despite his injuries from the explosion, had managed to prop himself against a boulder and was firing his sidearm at approaching Taliban soldiers. Blood soaked through the bandages that Corporal Martinez had applied to his chest and left leg, but the demolitions expert refused to stay down. "How much C4 do you have left, Thompson?" Rodriguez called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. 2 blocks, sir," Thompson replied through gritted teeth, "but I don't think I can place them effectively from here." Rodriguez's mind raced through their limited options. They could try to fight their way down the mountain, but that would mean abandoning any hope of rescue and likely result in the death of Thompson, who couldn't move quickly enough. They could attempt to call in an airstrike on their own position, but their radio communications remained jammed, and such an action would be suicide anyway. The third option was to make their last stand here and hope that somehow, against all odds, help would arrive before their ammunition ran out completely. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one that gave his team any chance of survival. "Sullivan, any luck with the radio?" Rodriguez shouted to his communications specialist, who was frantically adjusting frequencies and checking equipment behind a large boulder that served as their command post. "Negative, sir," Sullivan replied, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm getting nothing but static on all channels. It's like we're completely cut off from the outside world." The Taliban fighters were getting closer, their voices echoing off the mountain walls as they coordinated their assault in rapid Pashto. Rodriguez could make out enough of their language to understand that they were planning to surround the SEAL position completely before launching their final attack. Suddenly, Petty Officer Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain, I count at least 40 hostiles converging on our position from 3 different directions. They'll be in grenade range within 5 minutes. Rodriguez felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. These men had followed him into this hellish situation, trusting his leadership and tactical decisions. Now it appeared that trust would cost them their lives. The captain had always prided himself on bringing his team home safely, but this time, he had failed them when it mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on him that Khalil Ahmad, the asset they had risked everything to extract, was probably already dead. The Taliban had likely tortured him for information about American operations before using his intelligence to set this trap. Rodriguez and his team had walked directly into an ambush that could have been avoided if the intelligence community had been more careful about vetting their sources. "Listen up," Rodriguez called to his team, his voice carrying the authority that had seen them through countless dangerous missions. "We're in a tough spot, but we're not done fighting. Every round counts now, so make them all matter. We hold this position until help arrives or until we can't hold it anymore." The SEALs acknowledged their captain's words with grim nods, checking their remaining ammunition and adjusting their positions for the coming assault. These were warriors who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions the military had to offer, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Corpsman Martinez finished applying fresh bandages to Thompson's wounds and crawled over to Rodriguez's position. "Sir, Thompson's lost a lot of blood, but he's stable for now. The rest of the team has minor injuries, nothing that should affect their fighting ability." Rodriguez nodded, grateful for Martinez's medical expertise. The young corpsman had saved countless lives during their deployment, often under fire and in impossible conditions. If they somehow survived this engagement, it would largely be due to his skill and dedication. The Taliban assault resumed with renewed intensity, automatic weapons fire echoing off the rocky walls like thunder. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions as the insurgents tried to pin down his team while other fighters maneuvered for better angles of attack. Wilson's sniper rifle spoke again, and another Taliban fighter fell, but immediately 2 more appeared to take his place. The enemy's tactics were sound. They were using their numerical superiority to overwhelm the SEALs' defensive positions through coordinated fire and movement. Rodriguez's rifle clicked empty, and he reached for his last magazine with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Around him, he could hear his teammates making the same motion, the distinctive sound of magazines being changed under fire. They were down to their final rounds, and the Taliban showed no signs of backing down. "It's over," Rodriguez whispered to himself, the words barely audible above the gunfire. He had never spoken those words during a mission, never allowed himself to believe that a situation was hopeless. But as he watched dozens of Taliban fighters closing in on their position from all sides, the SEAL captain realized that sometimes, despite all the training and determination in the world, good men died in bad situations. The sound of his own voice saying those words shocked him. Throughout his career, Rodriguez had built a reputation for never giving up, for finding solutions when others saw only problems. His team trusted him to get them out of impossible situations, and he had never let them down before. But this time felt different. This time the odds were simply too overwhelming to overcome. Just as Rodriguez felt despair beginning to overwhelm him, a memory flashed through his mind with startling clarity. He was 8 years old, sitting in his grandfather's workshop in San Antonio, watching the old man carefully clean his rifle from the Korean War. The workshop smelled of gun oil and sawdust, and his grandfather's weathered hands moved with the precision of someone who had relied on that weapon to stay alive. "Mijo," his grandfather had said in his heavily accented English, "a warrior never surrenders while he still has 1 bullet left. Sometimes 1 bullet is all you need to change everything." Rodriguez had carried those words with him through SEAL training, through his first combat deployment in Iraq, and through dozens of dangerous missions in Afghanistan. But until this moment, surrounded by enemy fighters on a barren mountainside, he hadn't fully understood what his grandfather meant. The captain ejected his empty magazine and slammed his last one home with renewed determination. Around him, his team continued fighting with the same professional calm they had displayed in countless other engagements, but Rodriguez could see the strain in their faces. They were down to single-digit round counts, and the Taliban were closing in from all sides. Suddenly, Sullivan's radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a faint voice speaking in heavily accented English. "American soldiers, this is Khalil Ahmad. Can you hear me?" Rodriguez and Sullivan exchanged shocked glances. Their target was still alive, apparently somewhere close enough to reach them on short-range radio frequencies. But was it really Ahmad? Or was this another Taliban trick designed to lure them into an even worse position? This is Captain Rodriguez, SEAL Team 6. Identify yourself with the authentication code from your last transmission to Bagram, Rodriguez responded, his finger hovering over the radio transmit button. Blue Moon 77, came the immediate reply. Captain, I am in cave system approximately 200 meters north of your position. Taliban does not know about these caves. There is path down mountain that leads to extraction point. Rodriguez's mind raced. The authentication code was correct, which meant this was likely the real Khalil Ahmad. But it could also mean the Taliban had tortured the information out of him and were now using his voice to draw the SEALs into an ambush. How do we know this isn't a trap? Rodriguez asked into the radio, ducking as bullets sparked off the rocks around his position. Because, Captain, I have been fighting Taliban for 20 years, before you Americans even knew they existed. I know these mountains better than they do. Trust me or die where you are. Those are your only choices. The brutal honesty in Ahmad's voice convinced Rodriguez that the transmission was genuine. The former Taliban commander had risked everything to work with American forces, and his intelligence had already saved countless lives. If he said there was a way out, it was worth the risk. What's your assessment, sir? Asked Petty Officer Chen, who had been listening to the radio exchange while maintaining his sniper overwatch. Rodriguez looked around at his team's positions. The Taliban fighters were now close enough that he could hear their individual voices as they coordinated their final assault. In perhaps 30 seconds, enemy grenades would start landing in their defensive perimeter, and the battle would be over. We're moving to Ahmad's position, Rodriguez announced. Wilson and Chen provide covering fire. Thompson, can you move? I can move, sir, Thompson replied, struggling to his feet with Martinez's assistance. Blood had soaked through his bandages again, but the demolitions expert's eyes remained focused and determined. Sullivan, tell Ahmad we're coming to him. Everyone else, prepare to move on my signal. The next 60 seconds would determine whether Rodriguez's decision would save his team or get them all killed. Moving from their current defensive positions would expose them to enemy fire, but staying put guaranteed their destruction. Sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation was to do something impossibly dangerous. Ahmad, this is Rodriguez. Guide us to your position. Move north 30 meters to large boulder shaped like camel's head. I will provide covering fire from cave entrance. Rodriguez spotted the boulder Ahmad was describing. It did indeed resemble a camel's head when viewed from their current angle, and it would provide some cover during their movement. But reaching it would require crossing an open area that was completely exposed to enemy fire. On my mark, Rodriguez called to his team. 3, 2, 1, move. The SEALs broke from their position simultaneously, Wilson and Chen laying down suppressive fire while the rest of the team sprinted toward the camel-shaped boulder. Taliban fighters immediately shifted their aim toward the moving Americans, bullets kicking up dust and rock fragments around the running men. Rodriguez felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that accompanied moments of extreme danger. Each step seemed to take forever. Each breath burned in his lungs and the sound of gunfire became strangely muffled. He had experienced this phenomenon many times during combat, but it never ceased to amaze him how the human mind adapted to life-threatening situations. Thompson stumbled halfway to the boulder, his wounded leg giving out under the stress of rapid movement. Martinez immediately stopped to help him, exposing both men to increased enemy fire. Rodriguez saw muzzle flashes from at least 4 different Taliban positions converging on his wounded teammates. Without hesitation, Rodriguez changed direction and sprinted toward Thompson and Martinez, his rifle already aimed at the nearest enemy position. He fired 3 quick shots, saw 1 Taliban fighter fall, then grabbed Thompson's left arm while Martinez supported his right side. Keep moving, Rodriguez shouted, half-carrying Thompson toward the relative safety of the boulder while bullets whistled. Past their heads, they reached the camel-shaped rock just as Ahmad's covering fire erupted from a narrow cave entrance, 20 meters up the mountainside. The former Taliban commander was using an ancient Soviet-era rifle, but his shots were precise and effective, forcing the pursuing Taliban fighters to take cover. Up here, quickly, Ahmad called, his voice echoing off the cave walls. Rodriguez looked up at the cave entrance and realized it could only be reached by climbing across loose rocks and narrow ledges. With Thompson's injuries, the ascent would be extremely dangerous, but staying in their current position was certain death. "Wilson, Chen, fall back to this position," Rodriguez ordered into his radio. "We're moving to higher ground." The two snipers acknowledged and began their own fighting retreat, using fire and movement tactics to break contact with the Taliban forces that had been trying to flank their original position. As Rodriguez helped boost Thompson up toward the cave entrance, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. At least 50 more Taliban fighters were moving up the mountain from the valley below, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. Even if Ahmad's cave system provided temporary safety, they would soon be facing an entire regiment of enemy soldiers. The captain pushed those thoughts aside and focused on getting his team to safety, one man at a time. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes one bullet could change everything. Rodriguez didn't know how or when that moment would come, but he was determined to keep fighting until it did. The cave entrance was barely wide enough for one person at a time, forcing the SEALs to climb single file up the treacherous rock face while Taliban bullets chipped away at the stone around them. Ahmad reached down from the cave mouth, his weathered hands surprisingly strong as he helped pull each American to safety. Rodriguez went last, providing covering fire for his team, while they made the dangerous ascent. As he finally hauled himself into the cave, he got his first good look at the man they had risked everything to extract. Khalil Ahmad was smaller than his photograph suggested, probably in his 60s with intelligent eyes that had seen too much violence. His traditional Afghan clothing was torn and dirty, and a partially healed scar ran along his left cheek. "Welcome to my office," Ahmad said with a slight smile, gesturing deeper into the cave system. "Taliban has been looking for me for 3 days, but they do not know about these caves. My grandfather used them to fight against British in 1920s. The cave stretched back into the mountain much farther than Rodriguez had expected. Ancient passages carved by water and time created a maze of tunnels that seemed to extend in multiple directions. Ahmad led them confidently through the darkness, using a small flashlight to illuminate their path. "How long have you been hiding here?" Rodriguez asked as they moved deeper underground. "Since the night I sent emergency signal to your people," Ahmad replied. "Taliban discovered my true loyalty and came to village to kill me. I barely escaped with my life. I have been waiting here hoping American soldiers would come." Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that their intelligence asset was still alive, but guilt that his team's rescue mission had nearly resulted in disaster. The captain had made tactical errors that put his men at risk, and only Ahmad's local knowledge was keeping them alive now. Behind them, they could hear Taliban fighters shouting to each other as they searched for the cave entrance. The enemy knew the Americans had disappeared somewhere on the mountainside, but the cave mouth was well concealed behind fallen rocks and scrub vegetation. "Sir, I'm getting signals again," Sullivan reported, holding up his radio. "Whatever was jamming our communications doesn't penetrate this deep underground." Rodriguez felt a surge of hope. If they could re-establish contact with their command, extraction might still be possible. "Try to reach Bagram. Tell them our situation and current location." While Sullivan worked with his radio equipment, Corpsman Martinez tended to Thompson's wounds in the improved lighting conditions of the cave. The demolitions expert had lost more blood than initially apparent, and his face was pale with shock. "How is he, Doc?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "He needs immediate medical attention, sir. I can keep him stable for a few more hours, but he needs surgery to repair the internal damage from that explosion." Rodriguez nodded grimly. Time was working against them in multiple ways. The Taliban would eventually find the cave entrance. Thompson needed medical care they couldn't provide, and their extraction window was rapidly closing. Ahmad led them to a wider chamber deeper in the cave system, where ancient stone carvings covered the walls. "This place is sacred to my people," he explained. "Taliban would not normally search here, but they want you Americans very badly. Your presence here brings great danger. Why did you risk everything to help us?" Rodriguez asked. "You could have stayed loyal to the Taliban and lived safely." Ahmad's expression grew serious. "Captain, I have spent my entire life fighting wars. First against Soviets, then against other Afghan tribes, then with Taliban against Northern Alliance. Always fighting, always killing. But when I see what Taliban does to innocent people, to children, to women who just want to learn to read, I realize I have been fighting for wrong side." The former Taliban commander paused, his eyes reflecting memories of violence and regret. Your country is not perfect, Captain, but at least you try to protect innocent people. Taliban only knows how to destroy. I'm old man now and I want to do something good before I die. Rodriguez was struck by the sincerity in Ahmad's voice. The man had given up everything, his position, his security, his life in his homeland, to provide intelligence that could save lives. Whatever mistakes the American intelligence community had made in handling this operation, Ahmad's courage was unquestionable. Bagram Base. This is Ghost Team over, Sullivan called into his radio, finally making contact with their command. Ghost Team, this is Bagram. We've been trying to reach you for 6 hours. What's your status? We're alive but in extreme danger. Rodriguez took the radio from Sullivan. Request immediate extraction. We have the package and need urgent medical evacuation for 1 wounded. Understood, Ghost Team. Be advised, Taliban forces have surrounded the entire area. We're working on extraction options, but it may take several hours to coordinate. Several hours. Rodriguez closed his eyes and tried to remain calm. Thompson might not survive several more hours without proper medical care, and the Taliban would certainly find their hiding place long before then. Sir, there might be another option, Ahmad said quietly. These caves connect to old mining tunnels that lead down to valley floor, 3 kilometers from here. British built them during occupation to extract copper from mountain. Taliban does not know about them because entrance was sealed many years ago. Rodriguez studied the Afghan's face carefully. Can you guide us through these tunnels? Yes, but journey is dangerous. Some passages are flooded, others have collapsed, and if Taliban discovers we are using tunnels, they will try to trap us underground. It wasn't much of a choice. Stay in the caves and wait for capture or death, or attempt a dangerous underground journey that might lead to freedom. Rodriguez looked at his team, seeing determination mixed with exhaustion in their faces. Thompson spoke up from where he lay against the cave wall. Sir, I can make it through those tunnels. Don't make decisions based on my condition. Rodriguez admired the sergeant's courage, but he could see that Thompson was barely conscious. Moving him through flooded tunnels and collapsed passages might kill him outright. How long would it take to reach the valley floor? Rodriguez asked Ahmad. 6 hours, maybe 8 if we move carefully. But Captain, there is something else you should know. I have information about Taliban plans that your government needs. They are planning major attack against American base in Kabul, using suicide bombers and vehicle explosives. Many people will die if I cannot deliver this intelligence. Rodriguez felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again. Not only did he need to get his team to safety, but Ahmad's intelligence could prevent another terrorist attack that might kill dozens of American soldiers and Afghan civilians. The sound of voices outside the cave entrance grew louder, indicating that Taliban search parties were getting closer to discovering their hiding place. Rodriguez knew that whatever decision he made, it would have to be made quickly. We're going through the tunnels, he announced to his team. Ahmad will guide us and will carry Thompson if necessary. This mission isn't over yet. The ancient mining tunnels were even more treacherous than Ahmad had described. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating slippery conditions underfoot, and the air grew thicker and more stale the deeper they ventured underground. Rodriguez had to fight back waves of claustrophobia as the tunnel walls seemed to close in around them. Ahmad moved through the passages with the confidence of someone who had explored them extensively, but even he occasionally paused to examine junction points where multiple tunnels branched off in different directions. The cave system was more complex than any map could have indicated, carved out over decades by British engineers who had long since abandoned their mining operations. Thompson was barely conscious now, supported between Martinez and Wilson as they navigated the underground maze. The demolitions experts' breathing had become shallow and labored, and Rodriguez knew they were running out of time. If they didn't reach medical evacuation soon, Thompson would die in these tunnels far from home and family. How much farther? Rodriguez whispered to Ahmad, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. 2 kilometers, maybe less, Ahmad replied, but Rodriguez could hear uncertainty in his voice. The passages had changed since the former Taliban commander's last visit, with some sections partially collapsed and others completely flooded. They had been underground for 3 hours when they encountered their first major obstacle. A section of tunnel that Ahmad remembered as passable was now completely blocked by fallen rocks and debris. Water had apparently weakened the supporting structures over time, causing a catastrophic collapse that sealed off their planned route. "There is another way," Ahmad said after examining the blockage carefully, "but it requires going deeper, through tunnels that were abandoned even when British were here. Very dangerous." Rodriguez studied their alternatives on the rough map Ahmad had sketched in the dirt. The alternative route would add at least 2 hours to their journey and take them through sections of the tunnel system that might not be stable. But they had no choice. The way forward was completely blocked. As they prepared to take the deeper route, Sullivan's radio crackled with static. He adjusted the frequency and managed to pick up fragments of Taliban communications. Although Rodriguez couldn't understand the Pashto language, Ahmad's expression grew increasingly concerned as he listened. "What are they saying?" Rodriguez asked. "They have found cave entrance," Ahmad replied grimly. "Taliban fighters are entering cave system now following our path. They know we are in tunnels." The news hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Their pursuers were now behind them in the underground passages, and the SEAL team was trapped between collapsed tunnels ahead and armed Taliban fighters behind. The situation had gone from desperate to seemingly impossible. "How long before they catch up to us?" Rodriguez asked. "If they know these tunnels, maybe 2 hours. If they must search every passage, maybe 4 hours." Rodriguez made quick calculations in his head. Even taking the longer, more dangerous route, they should reach the valley floor before the Taliban caught up to them. But that assumed the alternative tunnels were passable, and that Thompson could survive the additional underground travel. "We keep moving," Rodriguez decided. "Double time pace, but watch for unstable sections." The deeper tunnels were noticeably different from the passages they had been using. The air was thicker and had a metallic taste that suggested dangerous gases might be present. The walls were rougher, carved more hastily and with less engineering expertise than the upper levels. Chen took point, using his sniper's training to spot potential dangers in the dim light of their flashlights. Behind him, Rodriguez and Sullivan carried most of Thompson's weight while Martinez monitored his vital signs and Ahmad guided them through the maze of branching passages. They had been moving for 30 minutes when Chen suddenly held up his hand, signaling for the team to stop. Ahead of them, the tunnel floor disappeared into a pool of dark water that stretched as far as their lights could penetrate. "This section floods during rain season," Ahmad explained. "Water comes from mountain runoff, but it should not be this deep now." Rodriguez estimated the water was at least 4 feet deep, possibly more in the center of the flooded section. Swimming through it while carrying Thompson would be extremely dangerous, especially since they had no way of knowing what lay beneath the surface. "Any other routes?" Rodriguez asked. Ahmad shook his head. "This is only way to reach valley floor from here. We must go through water." Rodriguez studied the flooded passage carefully. The tunnel continued on the other side of the water, visible in the distance. If they could make it across, they would still have a chance of reaching safety. But if Thompson went under in his weakened condition, he would almost certainly drown. "I'll go first," Rodriguez announced. "Test the depth and current. If it's passable, we'll figure out how to get Thompson across safely." Before anyone could object, Rodriguez waded into the cold water. It was deeper than he had estimated, reaching nearly to his chest by the time he was halfway across. The current was strong enough to make walking difficult, and the bottom was covered with loose rocks that shifted under his weight. But it was passable. Rodriguez made it to the other side and called back to his team. "It's doable, but we'll need to be very careful with Thompson." Martinez had an idea. Using their emergency medical supplies, he fashioned a makeshift flotation device that would keep Thompson's head above water while allowing the team to guide him across. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only option. The crossing took 20 agonizing minutes. Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness as they carefully guided him through the water, and twice Rodriguez thought they had lost him. But Martinez's improvised flotation system worked, and eventually all 6 men made it safely to the other side. As they continued through the tunnels, Rodriguez could hear distant sounds echoing through the passages behind them. The Taliban fighters were making faster progress than expected, possibly using local guides who knew shortcuts through the cave system. "How much farther to the exit?" Rodriguez asked Ahmad urgently. 1 kilometer, maybe less. "But Captain, there is problem with exit. It opens into valley very close to Taliban patrol routes. We must be very careful when we emerge." Rodriguez felt his heart sink. After everything they had endured underground, they would still face danger when they reached the surface. But at least they would be back in terrain where his team's training and equipment would give them advantages over their pursuers. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Rodriguez could feel a slight movement of air that suggested they were approaching an exit. After hours in the stale underground atmosphere, the promise of fresh air was almost overwhelming. Ahmad led them around a final corner, and Rodriguez could see daylight filtering down from above. The tunnel exit was a vertical shaft that had been concealed by brush and fallen logs. It would be a difficult climb, especially while helping Thompson, but it represented freedom. As they prepared for the final ascent, Rodriguez heard something that made his blood freeze. The distinctive sound of Taliban voices was much closer than before, echoing through the tunnel system behind them. Their pursuers had made up significant time and were now perhaps only minutes away from catching up. "Move fast," Rodriguez ordered his team. "Get Thompson to the surface first, then defensive positions." But as Chen began climbing toward the surface, a burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from the tunnel behind them. The Taliban had found them, and the final confrontation was about to begin in the cramped confines of the underground passage. Muzzle flashes lit up the tunnel behind them like deadly fireworks as Taliban fighters opened fire from around the corner. Rodriguez pressed himself against the rough stone wall, feeling bullet fragments spray across his face as rounds ricocheted off the tunnel walls. The enclosed space amplified every sound, turning the gunfire into a deafening roar that threatened to burst their eardrums. "Get Thompson up that shaft now," Rodriguez shouted to Martinez and Wilson, who were already lifting the wounded sergeant toward the vertical exit. Chen had reached the surface and was providing covering fire down into the tunnel, his rifle barking steadily as he engaged the Taliban fighters below. Rodriguez counted at least 4 different weapons firing at them from the tunnel behind their position. The Taliban had caught up faster than expected, probably guided by locals who knew secret passages through the cave system. The enemy fighters were using the tunnel's natural choke point to their advantage, forcing the SEALs to climb to safety one at a time while under heavy fire. Sullivan had positioned himself at the corner where the tunnel curved, using a small outcropping of rock as cover, while he returned fire with precise, economical shots. Every bullet counted now. They were down to their last few magazines, and the climb to the surface would leave them completely exposed. "Ahmad, you're next up," Rodriguez ordered, but the former Taliban commander shook his head. "I fight with you, Captain. These are my people trying to kill us. I must help." Rodriguez wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. Ahmad picked up an AK-47 that one of the Taliban fighters had dropped earlier in their retreat, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. Despite his age, the man moved with the confidence of someone who had been fighting wars for decades. Martinez and Wilson had successfully gotten Thompson to the surface, and now Wilson was climbing back down to help with the defensive fight. The former Navy SEAL sniper took position opposite Sullivan, creating a crossfire that forced the Taliban attackers to approach more cautiously. But Rodriguez could hear more voices echoing through the tunnel system behind their immediate attackers. The Taliban were bringing up reinforcements, possibly dozens more fighters who would soon overwhelm their small defensive position through sheer numbers. "Sir, we need to move now," Chen called down from the surface. "I can see Taliban vehicles approaching the valley floor from multiple directions. They're trying to cut off our escape." Routes, Rodriguez realized they were facing the same tactical nightmare that had plagued them throughout this mission, caught between enemy forces with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The only difference was that now they were trapped in a tunnel instead of on an exposed mountainside. The captain checked his ammunition count. 7 rounds left in his current magazine with 1 full magazine remaining. Around him, his teammates were in similar situations. They had enough firepower for perhaps 2 minutes of sustained combat, but the Taliban seemed to have unlimited supplies and reinforcements. It was then that Rodriguez remembered Thompson's demolition charges. The injured sergeant had been carrying 2 blocks of C4 explosive when they started this mission, and those charges were now somewhere on the surface with his equipment. "Chen, where is Thompson's demo kit?" Rodriguez called up the shaft. "Right here with his gear." "Sir?" came the reply. "Lower me down 1 block of C4 and a timer. Carefully." Rodriguez's plan was desperate, but it might be their only chance. If he could collapse this section of tunnel, It would buy them time to escape to the surface and possibly trap the Taliban fighters behind the rockfall. The C4 explosive came down wrapped in medical bandages, along with a simple timer device that Thompson had taught all of them to use. Rodriguez had about 30 seconds to place the charge effectively before the Taliban fighters realized what he was doing. "Everyone up the shaft now," Rodriguez ordered. "Ahmad, you first." The former Taliban commander looked like he wanted to argue, but Rodriguez's tone brooked no discussion. Ahmad began climbing while Sullivan and Wilson maintained covering fire. Rodriguez crawled forward toward the tunnel corner where the fighting was heaviest. The C4 block clutched in his left hand while his rifle remained ready in his right. He could hear Taliban voices getting closer, their leaders urging them to advance despite the American defensive fire. The captain found a natural depression in the tunnel wall where the explosive would be most effective. The charge would need to be placed precisely to cause maximum structural damage without bringing down the entire tunnel system on top of them. As Rodriguez attached the timer to the C4, a Taliban fighter suddenly appeared around the corner just 10 feet away. The insurgent's eyes widened in surprise as he saw the American so close, and both men raised their weapons simultaneously. Time seemed suspended as Rodriguez looked down the barrel of the Taliban fighter's AK-47. This was the moment his grandfather had described, and when one bullet would change everything. But Rodriguez wasn't holding a rifle now. His hands were occupied with the explosive device that could save his team. The Taliban fighter's finger tightened on his trigger, and Rodriguez knew he was about to die. There was no time to reach for his sidearm, no time to dive for cover. The mission that had cost so much would end here, in a flooding tunnel beneath the Afghan mountains. But suddenly, a single rifle shot cracked through the tunnel, and the Taliban fighter pitched forward. A neat hole drilled through his forehead. Behind him stood Ahmad, the ancient Soviet rifle smoking in his weathered hands. "One bullet, Captain," Ahmad said quietly. "Like your grandfather told you." Rodriguez stared at the former Taliban commander in shock. He had never mentioned his grandfather's words to anyone, never spoken them aloud during the mission. Yet somehow Ahmad had known exactly what to say. "How did you—" Rodriguez began, but Ahmad cut him off. "Old soldiers recognize each other, my friend. Your grandfather fought in Korea, yes? I can see it in how you carry yourself, how you never give up. He taught you well." There was no time to process the strange connection, but Rodriguez felt a surge of renewed strength. He activated the timer on the C4, 30 seconds until detonation, and began climbing toward the surface as fast as his exhausted body would allow. The team pulled him out of the shaft just as Taliban reinforcements reached the tunnel junction below. Rodriguez could hear angry voices and the sound of boots on stone as the enemy fighters discovered their fallen comrade and realized what the Americans had planned. "Fire in the hole," Rodriguez shouted, and the entire team took cover behind a fallen log as the C4 detonated deep underground. The explosion was muffled by the earth above it, but the ground shook violently and a cloud of dust erupted from the tunnel entrance. When the dust settled, the shaft was completely sealed with tons of collapsed rock and debris. Rodriguez lay on his back, breathing heavily and staring up at the late afternoon sky. They had made it to the surface, but they were still deep in Taliban territory, with wounded personnel and limited ammunition. The mission wasn't over yet, but for the first time in 24 hours, Captain Marcus Rodriguez felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. His grandfather's words had proven true once again. Sometimes one shot really could change everything, and thanks to Khalil Ahmad's marksmanship and courage, Rodriguez's team was still alive to fight another day. As helicopters appeared on the horizon, racing toward their position with rescue and medical support, Rodriguez realized that this mission would be remembered not for its intelligence failures or tactical mistakes, but for the bond between warriors that transcended nationality, language, and even former loyalties. In the end, it was Ahmad's shot that had turned the tide and saved them all.